Thank you so much for attending, whether it's your afternoon, your morning, your evening, or even your late evening. We're really grateful for your attending this webinar today. We're very fortunate to have three distinguished leaders in the sector around transitioning to a new plastics economy and what the new normal looks like, to borrow from Paul's company's name. And so without further ado, I'll walk through the presentation very briefly, then I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll have Q&A with the panelists. I'll be moderating questions. Please put them in the chat. I will then be able to ask the panelists some questions. And obviously, as always, you probably will have more questions than we'll have time to discuss today. So please feel free to email me, or we also do capture all questions and we'll sort through them and reply within about at least 72 hours. Thank you so much. Today we're talking about the EU plastics and chemicals industry in need of a need of a zero waste transition. Briefly, who is Planet Tracker? Planet Tracker is a nonprofit financial think tank who works to align capital markets within planetary limits. We're focused on enabling the investor community to understand ecological limits so the investor community can take action and align their capital within planetary boundaries. Our plastic program aims to stem the flow of environmentally damaging plastics and related products that are creating a global waste and health issues during production, during use, and during the waste management. Yet we obviously realize that plastic is a necessary and needed good for the economy. Today we have three very exciting panelists. I'll start with Paul. Paul is chairman of New Normal Consulting. Paul is a trusted advisor to many major companies in the investment community. He's a long-term proven track record of being a wise and sage voice around the chemical and plastics nexus. I know for myself, I often have listened to your podcasts. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable by complimenting you, but it's just a real privilege to have you here. Paul had previously managed a $1 billion plastics business, ICI. Next, Tatiana Lujan. Tatiana is a plastics attorney with Client Earth. She is skilled in understanding the regulatory apparatus that frames business and the economy in the EU. She also has a very deep and long-term career, a lot of success in Latin America. Bruno Montaigne is a managing director and senior analyst at Bernstein. He covers the European food, home care, and personal care sectors. He's also very much a reliable and well-respected analyst in industry, often has been ranked #1, I believe, if I may say so. I hope you're proud of that. He covers many of the fast-moving consumer goods names that do use plastic products around in their packaging to meet their packaging needs. So, as always, we need to understand what is plastic, because plastic has many different definitions depending on the audience. So for today, we're simply going to use the 7 recycling codes you see here: PET for bottles, polyethylene for wraps, polyvinyl chloride for construction materials, which can include windows and door frames and pipes and many other uses, polyethylene, low linear density polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, and then category 7, which is a catch-all category for many other types of plastics. Now, plastics are a key product that benefits all of us, but yet during the production process, plastics can have and sometimes do have unnecessary negative environmental impacts. These environmental impacts also occur at times during use and also during waste management. So we have global warming impacts, fossil resource depletion, freshwater eutrophication, so damaging of freshwater ecosystems. Similarly, we have marine eutrophication, so negative impacts on marine ecosystems. You even have terrestrial acidification. Plastics can impact the pH of soils when it's put into a landfill, for example. You have photochemical oxidant formation, particulate matter formation, which obviously in some cases can produce the diseases some of us may suffer from, unfortunately, if we live in an urban environment. You have human toxicity. Some of the plastic production processes, the chemicals that are used during the 3 or 4 stages of production, can be carcinogenic if released into the environment. There's freshwater ecotoxicity and natural land transformation. Yet plastic is a necessary good. We all use plastic every single day. So we're all part of this problem, but we are all part of the solution too. Now, it's important to understand how plastic is made in the EU. This is simply an example. So we have many other similar supply chains that have been modeled out in the EU. As you can see here, there are 4 different colors. Blue is feedstock, so think of cracking. Then you have basic chemicals, is yellow. Intermediates, which is the next stage in the production process, that's orange. And plastics, which is red. Now, if you look through here, remember the colors, yellow, orange, and red. We'll see those repeated in subsequent slides. So what we see here in the polyvinyl chloride, ABS, polypropylene, and polyethylene supply chains is predominantly each production node in the EU is owned by in the most part, by publicly traded companies. So if you look at ethylene, 89% of ethylene capacity in the EU is owned by publicly traded companies. That's where the leverage and opportunity lays with large investors or index investors or economy-wide investors and sovereign wealth funds. If they want to engage on this topic, they have these companies in their portfolio. They may not recognize them as such, though. So blue, yellow, orange, red. Thank you for your patience on that. Oh, someone just asked, yes, the presentation will be shared after the talk. Yes, of course. We also have the webinar will be recorded and is available on our homepage. Now here is what plastics product capacity looks like in the EU, right? So we have 4 sets of colors here. We have the yellow, which is the basic chemicals, the orange, which is the intermediate chemicals, and the dark red, which is the plastic resins. So as we can see, much of the capacity in the EU is centered in key locations. These locations are called clusters. Formerly in German, Verbund. Don't ask me to speak any more German than that, even though I live in Austria. I'll try and by my best. But these are what you might call in English a chemical park. But these chemical parks are much bigger than like a 1,000 hectare facility. They're often connected through pipelines, such as ethylene and propylene pipelines that connect throughout the region. So for example, we have the trilateral chemical region itself, which is Flanders in Belgium, Netherlands, and North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. It's all connected by a set of pipes and infrastructure, and all functions, broadly speaking, as a single chemical production machine. That's where 45% of plastics capacity is in the EU if you aggregate all 9 different resins that we cover. You can see that here on your screen by the exaggerated stacked bar chart where you see along the Belgium-Netherlands border into North Rhine-Westphalia. Underneath that, you'll see a blue and red color, right? That is referring to 2017 toxic chemical releases, the quantity of events, not the risk, but the quantity of events, just to really be careful with this and understanding this. So what we do find is where there is more plastic capacity in the EU, you have higher quantity of toxic chemical releases measured by events also occurring. Here we mapped out 2,167 events that were provided to us by the public resource paid for by you if you live in the EU by your taxpayer dollars, the European Environmental Agency that tracks these things. Go on to the next slide. And I might be frozen here, I hope not. There we go. Okay. Now again, we see yellow, orange, and red, the same slide as before. Now we're looking at what's the distance between plastics production facilities and Natura 2000 protected areas. This gives you an idea of what when you look at production risks over the long term and the opportunities to mitigate those risks. Interestingly, while the EU has 18% of its land protected under Natura 2000 protected mechanism, think of national parks and protected areas if you're outside the EU, or key biodiversity areas. And also includes 8% of the marine ecosystem. The average distance between the center of these production facilities and the center of the closest Natura protected area is about 1.5 miles. That's the mean distance. Here we measured the estimates about 1,500 different production facilities and compared them to the Natura facilities themselves. All this information is available, provided by the EU, various agencies within the European government apparatus. So what we see coming forward in the next 4 years to 5 years is what we call a policy cliff. Cliff might be maybe not the right phrase, but it's just an event moment, right? Think of it that way. Here, we have many different policies that have been enacted to address specific types of supply chains around plastics to encourage innovation, to encourage solutions, encourage strategic change in direction by industry towards the zero waste transition. I won't read this slide for you, but just so you know, there's everything from 800 euro per ton plastic waste tax that was implemented this January 1 of this year to 77% plastic bottle collection in 2025. Some of these numbers change over time. They may increase, they may decrease as interaction between stakeholders and government policy and business change them and reflect newer information. But what happens over time is we're seeing a decrease in the need for plastic plastic, in particular single-use plastic in the EU over the next 4 years. So where does it leave industry? Now, there are 88 companies across the EU 27 plastic supply chain, from basic chemicals, remember that's yellow, to intermediates, which is orange, to plastic resins, which is red. And the top 30 companies are dominated by publicly traded companies with 72% of total capacity in the EU 27. So again, if you're an investor, an asset manager, an asset owner, a sovereign wealth fund, or a bank, the opportunity is really today about how to consider and engage with your clients, about how to help them think of ways to transition to becoming which would be quite inspiring, the first publicly traded large plastics producer who 100% embraces a zero waste future. I think it's like Tesla has embraced electric cars, a plastics production company or a petrochemical name that does something similar could really see a difference in how they're perceived by the public, with improving reputation and obviously improvement in their business opportunities going forward. There's about $750 billion in the sector that's invested across bank, brokerage, insurance companies, investment advisors. And so that's pretty typical for this sector. It's comparable to what you'd find in the US or other regions in the world. So that gives you an idea of what the landscape looks like. So let's talk about where we can go from an innovation perspective. And this is probably the most important part of today's conversation, because now I've laid out the model that describes how there's toxic chemical releases during production. There's clear issues on co-location and nearness to protected areas, because there could be spillover from the chemical park production through various waste into that protected area, and there's a regulatory risk there potentially. Tatiana will probably talk to that. We have issues on the policy cliff, or the change in direction the EU is pushing the plastics economy towards less single-use plastic and more long-lived plastic and better products. So within that, what does innovation look like? Now, I want to be clear, while I work for a not-for-profit financial think tank, what you see in the screen here is how the industry itself has suggested that innovation should occur. I simply have summarized it into an S curve around, as you can see, as the green arrow goes up, it's like an S curve for innovation. So we see that in the next calendar year, alternative materials, article design, and sustainable recycling is competitive. It's already competitive on a price point basis, according to industry itself. In the next couple of years, we use the framework of system ready. Further article design, increasing recyclability, and longer term, more efficient material usage is also going to move from system ready to competitive. There are prototypes out there for addressing micro and nanoplastics and also alternative materials, whether it's sugarcane or it's obviously pulp-based timber products that can be a feedstock or other feedstocks. Those exist. There's opportunities around article design, such as in molding. So you have to think of a PET bottle. You have one less layer of plastic wrapped around the bottle. You in mold your logo into the bottle itself. That improves the recyclability. You can, there's prototypes and options around extended lifetime of the actual product. So the product will last a longer time, which then improves opportunity for reuse and refill, which is certainly a growing market. That we do have large corporates now that are piloting refill and reuse models, actually using robots that go to different businesses indoors to automatically refill pet food products around the world. Then you have issues and opportunities around sustainable recycling and extending the lifetime of actual plastic products. So with that, I'd like to pass. I want to thank you all very much, but I'll quickly pass it to my colleagues here and ask for some thoughts what they think of where the future may go. So Paul, where do you think the sector is going to be in 2025? Do you think a well-known or maybe a lesser-known plastics name may decide to fully embrace the zero-waste economy? Do you have any sense on what if that'll happen and what it would take for a company to make those sets of choices?
Yeah, I thought it was a fascinating presentation, Gabriel. So where I'm starting from is I think that we have to recognize that the industry, like most industries, lives in silos. And so we're looking at an industry which is, it's very strong in its vertical. It does a very good job in that area. But like all incumbents, it's not very good at looking across the landscape and seeing what's coming in, if you like, round the corner. And there are two corners that, unfortunately, it's failing to notice. One is the fairly dramatic developments that are taking place upstream. And I mean by that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, saying a couple of weeks ago, we don't need any more fossil fuel investments. We should be moving to recycling. I mean, the Dutch court decision on Shell saying by 2030, you've got to reduce your emissions globally by 45%. Oh, and by the way, because you're a Dutch company, you're subject to Dutch law. So that means globally, not just in Holland, because Shell emits 3% of all global emissions. So I think, I haven't talked to Shell about this, so I can discuss it happily. I think that Shell will probably push that as a baseline for everyone, that the whole industry will move to that. So that will mean a lot of refinery closures. I mean, a really lot. I mean, Shell have already said they were only intending to go to 6 refineries by 2025 compared to 54 in 2005. So that means there won't be very much feedstock for the plastics industry from naphtha and so on. And then the other side, the other end of the value chain, Bruno's area, the plastics companies are very much under pressure from consumers around recycling. And there are these targets. And of course, consumers also vote, which is why in Europe, for example, we have a target of 10 million tons of recycled feedstock for plastics within 4 years. And the industry is sitting here at the moment, I wouldn't say doing nothing, but if I sort of talk about winners and potential winners and losers, just to sort of to highlight the issue, I think you can look at companies like Arkema and Covestro as being companies who have really grasped the magnitude of this issue. Now, you may say they're not moving fast enough or whatever. Probably they would agree themselves. But they are on the right lines, and so they may well, and they could speed up quite dramatically, given a fair wind. On the other hand, these are particularly American companies, and I love them dearly, but they are in the potential loser category at the moment. ExxonMobil, LyondellBasell, Dow. If you look at their websites, they're not talking about any of these issues at all. They're talking about the traditional metrics of shareholder value, efficiency, and so on. And of course, the chemical industry has always been a force for good. We continue to do that, but we've really got to move very dramatically now, because we aren't going to have oil and gas feedstocks anymore. We're going through the Nova Institute. I don't know whether Bruno's come up against this. Nova Institute 2 or 3 weeks ago did a very, very good report for Unilever, which said fossil fuels you can get rid of because you can replace them with renewables. And we know how to do that cost effectively. Now, you can't get rid of plastics because plastics contain carbon. And if you throw out the carbon, it will get in the atmosphere, and that is not what you want, the CO2 limits. So you actually need to move instead to a new business model, which they called, quotes, the greatest transformation of the industry since the Industrial Revolution. And over a German company, so they don't go for hyperbole. It's the greatest transformation, and we move to, by 2050, 2/3 of all plastic will be made from recycled material, and 1/3 either from bio or from CO2. Now that's where we're going, and I absolutely agree with you, David, that investors, and we saw this investors with, Shell got hit by Friends of the Earth, but ExxonMobil and Shell got hit by investors who said, we don't want to lose our money here. Guys, you're doing the wrong thing. So I think there will be an enormous opportunity for the early adopters to go further down this track, the Archemas and the Covestro. And really, this is going to be a land grab. The people who get
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we see at the scale level, and then I'll go to Bruno, the scale of the EU plastics industry. So depending on the definition of who is employed, so depending which statistical agency definition we're using, because there's different ways of describing the quantity of employees directly or indirectly in the sector. We are looking at between 1.2 million and 2 to 3 million people employed directly or indirectly in the EU plastics production sector. There's going to be some conversation around the edges on that. Putting that aside, this is a just transition, sustainable, long-term sovereign risk issue. It's absolutely remarkable. We look at Belgium, which is the highest per capita chemical sales in the world. So what does Belgium do as a country in this transition that's happening very quickly, and there's not yet a broad, overarching, corporate, pre-competitive, collaborative set of voices that say from the executive level, this is our transition pathway and how we're going to make it occur within the timeline dictated either by the consumer downstream or concurrently by policy. I know, Bruno, you face a lot of the you work a lot with the fast-moving consumer goods companies. When they talk to you about plastics and their supply chain and packaging, how are they approaching this? Are they selling plastic that's wrapped, that has inside of it a food, like a food, or are they selling food that's wrapped in plastic? And how do they look at the packaging space that they're and around sustainability?
That's an interesting way to approach the question. Food and packaging are almost one and the same thing, right? When you're thinking about food, it needs to be healthy. It needs to be able to be portioned properly for different consumers at different price points. And the fact that you need to be able to maintain the quality of food means it isn't just a packaging issue, right? It's part of the quality of the product. is determined by your packaging. So I would argue packaging is, especially in food more than anywhere else, part of the entire product. That and you can't really take the quality component and the safety risk to health and all of that out of the equation there. And the second point is obviously my company aren't just making food; they have a huge responsibility to distribute food, and so distribution requires a certain level of packaging. So good luck trying to get your shampoo around the world if you're not allowed to package it. So there's different. So the packaging has a huge role to play within it, but at the same time, because contrary to the plastics companies, the value, I mean, execs at FMCG companies know that their only value stands by the value of the brand. And the brand is basically what is the emotional connection between consumers and your product. And today, what the emotions of consumers really determined by is how much they care about the environment as a rapidly growing change. So the incentive structure entirely there. They do need packaging. They can't just please consumers and say, we'll do without packaging. It's an integral part of your whole value proposition, but they're definitely 100% dedicated to making it work in a sort of a zero waste or an environmentally friendly way, because without it, they will simply lose their raison d'etre, their whole reason to exist as a branded company, because they're not just feeding you, they're making money of you through as being a brand as well. They basically have the double role. I'm not sure that totally answered your question, Gabriel, but
Absolutely. I just think that around packaging of food, we have this, I mean, from an academic perspective, it's quite fascinating because there's an intersection of land use, food and agriculture systems, even biodiversity, because that's what's built into the food we eat. There's water issues around the food we eat, but then around packaging, we also have the toxic chemical issues, but it's a necessary good because it prolongs the life of the food and the use case of the food. Obviously, it's a lighter weight in many cases than other packaging options. So there some will suggest that there's a lower GHG footprint around the use of plastic. Yet at the same time, you know, with this upcoming regulatory set of increasing regulatory push for innovation, Tatiana, how do you see industry reacting over the next 4 to 5 years? Do you have any thoughts or wise words for us as you sit there as a plastics attorney working? Maybe it's a stretch to say you're working with the companies, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know. I just feel the lack of imagination from many leaders in the industry makes me sad. Because you say like food and packaging are almost the same thing and they're inextricably linked together. And then I go to the supermarkets and I find apples wrapped in plastic. I know that those apples don't need the plastic to be sold. And then you say, good luck shipping your shampoo. Well, I'm from Colombia. I know many people who go to the store next to them and buy branded shampoo from a huge dispenser where they sell the shampoo in their own containers. And there are lots of innovations like stands where you can refill your bottle of shampoo the same way you buy soda in a cinema, where you don't actually need to buy the plastic bottle. People want the product itself and they buy the product because of the quality of the product, not necessarily because of all the plastic packaging that is around it. So if your product quality is good, you as a business, I would hope, should be able to sell it and have loyal customers. The pandemic has opened a full array of possibilities of how to do delivery to customers and create customer fidelity. For example, this is a very personal anecdote, but I'm getting my groceries from a place that is farmers that are getting together and sending a reusable crate to my house of unpackaged food, fruit and veg. It lasts longer in my fridge than the food I buy in the supermarket. So, and I'm creating less food waste. So for me, that inextricable link between food and packaging and plastic is not as inextricable. It just needs imagination, investment, scaling up of solutions that already exist. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation published a report in 2019 listing initiatives that would improve reusable solutions. And if only investors were geared towards that, if only company directors took their duties, legal duties, seriously, and were ahead of the curve when it came to seeing where their business was going, the threats that were coming from EU legislation, and as Paul very rightly said, the legal challenges against the fossil fuel industry.
Hi, Tatjana, you're responding to some of my shampoo bottle there. I wasn't trying to suggest the opposite of what you're saying. I agree with you. My main point is, it isn't, I mean, if you think about the commitments my companies have to make, there's many challenges from society, whether it's climate change, you know, making your factories green and buying renewable energy from a wind turbine rather than all. That's relatively straightforward. It's one input for another input. What I'm arguing is that if you're going to distribute your shampoo or your food in a safe way, it will require much bigger systematic change. I hear your example of the organic crates. We're trying to feed all of London with 10 million people in a small area with a distribution system that works. It can be done. I wasn't arguing it can't be done, but the complexity of the number of people involved is usually bigger than, let's say, an energy company deciding to switch off its coal plant and installing wind turbines in the sea. Both are technological problems, but to some extent they have control over the change. In this one, I think part of the reason, in my view, I might come to that later, the plastics company might not act much beyond having incentives. They're not in full control. Nobody in this supply chain is in full control to say, look, I have the silver bullet. And that's what I argue. So I'm just saying, you know, yes, you can get your food in different ways, but in a scalable way that's safe. There's design ideas, but then even the supply chain of making it work will require a huge amount of investment. That's why I'm saying it's a more integral part of it's an integral part for the company, at least, to think about distribution. And so they don't just think about selling shampoo, they're thinking about distributing shampoo. And so for them, they need to have an end-to-end solution that works throughout. So just didn't want to suggest we're disagreeing on that one, but everybody wants to make progress. And if anything, I would argue what they want, because Paul said something about, what did the words use, across the landscape kind of activity. If there's one thing I would commend FMCG companies for is, they seem to be the only ones I've seen in this whole supply chain that they take across the landscape responsibility. Even if it was on greenhouse emission, that scope 1, 2, 3, it's not that pernickety, oh, my little factory has a turbine on top. They're even taking commitments for the pollution taken at the consumer. And I think only the Unilevers, the Danones, the Nestlés of the world are really making these enormous commitments. So, and even it's quite challenging because they're not in control of the solution. Just think about it. They've promised to investors and all of us that they will do it, and they're not in control. I mean, they will feel the heat from doing that. And that
I'm listening to the debate, and I suppose I just want to take it, I want to get onto the front foot with it. I think because a year ago, 18 months ago, I was still quite depressed about what was happening and the fact that nobody was really doing it. You know, I was part of World Economic Forum, I've been a global expert there for several years. And, you know, we published the New Plastics Economy report back in 2016, and really, you know, very little was happening. And now it is happening. And this seems to me it's the most exciting phase of my working life. And I was heavily involved in the opening up of Asia, and I spent a lot of time in Asia in the late 80s, for example, when that was opening up, global supply chains and so on. This is far more interesting. And what we've got now is we've got masses of money available to us. You know, I could raise 100 million easily. I could raise $1 billion, you know, with some decent PowerPoints. And people are coming to me and saying, Paul, can you help us find these projects? So that is very good news, I think. And there's going to be an enormous amount of money made here, because exactly as Bruno is saying, what we've got to do is we've got to change the business model. At the moment, we have a linear value chain. We start with feedstock, we go to refinery, we go to crackers and petrochemicals, we go to polymer producers, we go to converters and so on. We're not going to have that anymore. We're going to have a circular economy where it's done locally. It's not, the large scale, the large scale cracking complexes, these, let's face it, I've been project advisor, more of them than I've had hot dinners sort of thing. Those $10 and $20 billion things, they're finished. It's gone. The world is gone now out there. Instead, we're going to have local production. We're going to have network distributed production, where based on turning waste centers into resource centers. And the people who are going to make money are going to be, I'll give you a moment while I explain this, are going to be the apples of the market. In other words, the people who revision the value chain and put it into place. Apple make whatever it is, 70% of all the money in smartphones. Why do they don't make anything. The key thing we are not doing properly at the moment is collection. We have to get collection going properly. We have waste companies.
Yeah.
Well, the name tells you. What do? They take waste. No, it's not waste. I mean, I don't think it's any great secret that when the Commission came to look at what is the justification for a circular economy, because you can't just do it because people think, oh, it would be a good idea. It's got to be there's got to be a market failure. And the market failure is really clear, that you're paying $60 for oil and investing billions and billions, trillions on finding it. You're then investing more billions in refining and in logistics and turning it into plastics. So we can all leave our offices or our homes today, go to a shop, pick up some plastic packaging and throw it away again. Yes. This is a complete market failure. And that was what the Commission took on board and said, that is the justification for the circular economy. Because none of us individually, even individual companies, can tackle that. So that's why we're here. Now, if you think about the amount of money that is wasted at the moment and the amount of money that could be saved, I can get you a positive return within 3 years on any recycling opportunity, because you're paid to take the feedstock away. Instead of paying 100 or 120 euros a ton to put it into waste, you say, look, if you give me 50 or 60, we split it, I'll take the 50 or 60, so I've got a negative cost of recycled feedstock. And believe me, this message is going through. I mean, it's in the public domain, so I can talk about it. I was the expert advisor last summer to the CEO Building Back Better task force, which the World Economic Forum set up. And you can read our report online on the web. It's all about the need to get into this area. It really was. And the CEOs on that panel really do grasp it. But we need investors to get behind it as well.
Absolutely, Paul. I couldn't. You said it perfectly well. Just for our audience, we're talking about reverse logistics. That's a phrase that you may be comfortable with or may hear again. And just to scope some numbers here, and then I'm gonna pass it to our excellent panel. In the U.S., for example, we have 332 million people that live there, 91,000 counties and cities. And each of those counties and cities have their own waste management policies, programs, procedures in place. In many cases, they say they recycle glass, they do not. They say they recycle plastic, they may not. Having been an environmental commissioner in my county for 8 years, I can speak explicitly to that in my own county. So that's the opportunity. How do we go from 332 million people in the United States, 447 million people in the EU 27, all the way back up through 91,000 communities in the US and a similar number in the EU, all the way to 20 or 30 large companies who can scale from a many to one model. It's a many to one model. We've done a very good job going the other way on logistics, from one to many. Dow, there's 20, for illustrative purposes, there's 20 companies that sell to 40 companies that sell to 100 companies. And then we end up with plastic in 447 million hands in the EU. But now we have to reverse that model. And that's where enormous creativity and innovation can occur. And that's what's very, very exciting about this time. Tatiana, yes, I think you wanted to jump in. Please jump in.
This is more a question to you and Bruno and Paul, but I'm not a numbers person at all. I remember reading a report by Carbon Tracker saying that plastics has untaxed externalities of $1,000 per ton, including like the carbon impacts, the plastic pollution, the health impacts. And if those are untaxed externalities, I see that the EU and many other countries around the globe are starting to internalize those externalities into the price of plastic by adopting, say, all the instruments you mentioned, the reform of the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, the Single-Use Plastic Directive, the reform to the ID Directive, etc. If those externalities were internalized, would that change the incentives for using plastic in packaging?
No, because the alternatives to plastics
Yeah.
are really not very good.
Uh-huh.
Let's be clear that there's a lot of packaging that's used that's not needed.
Yes.
So on. But if we get to food packaging, which does do a very good job of preserving food. Now, what you need, and particularly in the developing world, a third of food is wasted because it rots. Plastic on a cucumber, simple story, extends its shelf life from 3 days to 14 days. So,
Yeah.
But the problem is different in the West because a third of food, these are Food and Agriculture Organization data, that food there is food waste. Now, one of the things that baffles me about the industry is we've introduced sell-by dates about 30 or 40 years ago now. Why aren't we doing biomarkers? Why can't I go to my fridge and look at, okay, so the ham is notionally past its sell-by date, but why haven't I got a biomarker that tells me if it's actually safe to eat or not? This would be relatively simple to do. But if you look at the alternatives to plastics, where you need plastics, they are cardboard, they're glass, they're metal, and so on, which have a much higher CO2 content or impact. So plastics themselves are good, but the way we're delivering them and using them is bad. And that's the core issue here. And to be honest, it's not that difficult to change it once you get the political and economic will. We kind of know what to do here. I mean, I can't tell you that we've got a set of strategy directors around the world in these companies, and I would say at least 50% of them know what has to be done. But the investors aren't pushing them to do it, and as a result, they can't get the boards to consider it.
Well, is that an issue, Paul, where, as one of our audience members asked, is the investor analyst that's advising the petrochemical plastic supply chain in a different group or different org chart within the investment company than, say, the sustainability team at the investment
I think it's actually worse than that. We talk a lot to investors, obviously, 50% or so of our time. And people have dropped chemicals and plastics analysts. They now do them within a general industrials. So I can't tell you the number of new analysts who are handed on to me by their colleague. And it said, look, I've never done any of this. It's only 10% of what I'm doing. Can you give me a 101 on it? Of course, we're happy to do. And so there just isn't, not only is there not a focus on ESG, there isn't actually a focus on this industry. And yet, we are the third chemicals industry. It's the third largest industry in the world after energy and agriculture.
Yeah, when I was on Wall Street, that was a circumstance that I sat in. I was a chemicals analyst, and I covered other sectors of the economy also.
Yeah.
And I remember looking at a list of 30,000 chemicals in EU REACH and scratching my head and going, "Oh goodness."
Yeah. I mean, I remember I worked on .com for a while for an incredibly bright guy who was Harvard Law School and everything else, and he'd been a very, very successful manager. And I wandered into his desk in San Francisco one day, and his head was in his hands, and he said, "This chemicals industry is just so complicated." Sorry, it is.
That's really true. We have one opportunity, and Bruno and Tatiana, I'm curious what you think. So obviously the ruling in the Dutch court came out recently, and Paul, your team wrote an excellent analysis on that, and I don't know if that can be shared. We can distribute that to our audience members if you like. Okay, good. And so it's not clear to me if that includes scope 3, but it's scope 1 and 2.
I think it does. Yeah.
Includes scope 3.
It said all emissions, which
emissions from your products. That's scope 3.
Okay, so in that case, is one option for Shell and other companies who are in the petrochemical business and the plastics production business to pursue insetting, which is inserting within their processes reduction technologies, so that GHG reduction technologies, either using alternative feedstocks or other tools. Do you see that as an option that can, in other words, can feedstocks that have less GHG footprint fit inside existing supply chains for some of these large plants?
I think the answer is no, because there are all sorts of things happening at the same time. And what we have to look at is not really the development of electric vehicles, which is quite important, but the move by the majors to autonomous vehicles. So I'm not talking about Tesla here, because Elon Musk is never going to get there. But you look at GM, you look at VW, you look at the majors, and they are quite serious. I mean, if you go on the VW website, for example, or GM, I've been talking to them recently. What you see is they are completely reimagining the mobility industry. So you're going to be selling within 3 to 4 years, electric vehicles will be far cheaper than gasoline vehicles and diesel vehicles. So nobody's going to buy them. There's this idea, I've talked to some oil companies who say, oh, but we'll still be selling gasoline and diesel in Africa. And I go, excuse me, why would the poorest people in the world buy the most expensive cars?
Yeah, and within that model, this is US specific numbers, but if for example, Shell has 20,000 retail distribution stations, right? Each station has a on paper only $1 million liability associated with cleanup of that station when that station transitions to an electric vehicle charger station. So that's $20 billion already.
Well, the history of this is that you look at when refineries close, you don't actually ever close them, because that would trigger the cleanup fund. What you do is you transfer them to storage. And so what I think is going to happen, we're already seeing the majors starting to think about this, is that there is people are fooled in the car, when they look at the car industry, by saying, oh, well, the car industry has always been about technology, engine technology, it will now be about battery technology. Technology is going to be just a commodity. So what you can do is you could transfer those service stations into fast charging, battery swapping. And if you do that, and again, you talk to the car companies, and this is what they want to do. They want to become like the mobile phone. They want to sell you a bundle, so that you buy a car, buy on a monthly thing. So you say, look, I'm going to need so much. I need to drive there, or I need to drive so many miles, or whatever it is, or kilometers. And you have a bundle that allows you to do that. And you just go to the service station and you swap the battery over. The Japanese,
would that be an option?
But the Japanese motorcycle manufacturers were a bit further ahead than others, and they're over 50% of the world market. They've all agreed to go to battery swapping. So motorcycles can do it, so can cars. So that's the way out for the oil companies. They don't have to worry about that cost.
Okay, that's interesting. But could we, Bruno, from where you're sitting with fast-moving consumer goods companies, could that bundling model also work with understanding that within that we have refill and reuse? And we have some very good examples of refill and reuse in Latin America with Coca-Cola and other companies. Is there a branding opportunity, an equity lift there? Or is there a way for the fast-moving consumer goods companies to explore this deliberately to push upstream innovation in the packaging, containers, and plastics companies, and also the resin producers?
Yeah, Gabriel, but before I answer it, I'm going to tie it into one of the questions that I see on the Q&A board, which actually I like a lot, and it will get onto your point. I think somebody just asked, hi everybody, you're talking a lot about recycling being the ultimate solution. But as you know, recycling today hides a lot of downcycling, especially for plastics and food packaging, that we cannot recycle in a sufficient non-toxic way. Is recycled content the only levy to solve plastic crisis and mobilize companies? Which is a bit like, and I think that's what I fully agree with that person. Anybody who gets too excited by the single solution is fooling themselves almost a little bit. And in the end, the stuff that Tatjana was talking about earlier, rethinking completely the supply chain. How do you do pet food without plastic is going to be part of the solution. So if we really think we can solve food and FMCG by having better recycling alone, I'm not saying it's not going to be helping, but you need to rethink about, okay, what is the role the product solve? How can we get it to the consumer? Completely rethinking, where does it get produced? How do you distribute it? And now when you do the packaging, actually, how simple can the packaging be? Can we design the packaging such that it's that easy to separate between water and plastic? I think Nestle just has issued a bottle that's part plastic plus paper, and you can easily rip it apart, and it's much lighter than both. So you read it. This is my key thing, is none of it. You have to go through the whole supply chain, every single little bit of it. And I think there is almost an element to think that zero plastic seems possibly wrong. Plastics is a great material. And I could easily see a future that maybe 70, 80% of our plastic is recycled, but given the quality of food, we might need some virgin plastic for the quality, but then we make sure it gets properly recycled and you make your clothes out of it, or whatever other use there is. And so anything that's too marginal looking in one single solution is never going to deal with
I think the thing is, Bruno, if you look at the technology side, PET recycling, which does very well at the moment, and 40% or so of PET soda bottles and so on are recycled already. But that's because it's a single layer plastic. And so when it goes through the waste site, the scanner picks up the barcode, off it goes. But as you say, it's downcycled, so it can't be used again. It can only go 3 or 4, 12 or so times. But when you go to chemical recycling, you can do. But the issue you've got, and I've had some fabulous conversations with your companies on this, is you have to say to them, look, if you want to do chemical recycling, you actually have to stop using black. You have to stop using this. Oh, we can't do that. So, well, what do you want most? Does the consumer want a fancy logo, or does she want a recycled product? You know, it's a decision point. And this is why we've all got to work together here, because if the brand owners don't produce their products in a form that can be properly recycled and separated, then they can't be recycled. So, you know, and to be honest, I am fantastically encouraged by the discussions that have taken place over the last 2 years. You know, I think it was only 2 years ago that I went to the first meetings on this, and we were all kind of introducing ourselves. Oh, hello. Oh, what do you do? Oh, that's interesting. I've always wanted to meet you, and so on. And now we're really getting into this. You know, I'm sorry, but actually, I know I've got a problem, but so have you. You've got some awkward conversations back at head office as well. And that's how we get progress.
Talking about working together, maybe an even more upstream solution would be the standardization of packaging, where, for example, all beers, all waters, or were sold in the same kind of bottle, in the same kind of packaging, and the only thing that distinguished it were, for example, a fully recyclable paper label. Yeah. So that way,
Bruno, I guess, would say that the brand owner won't be particularly pleased by commodity. I mean, supermarkets could do it. I mean, I think it's very interesting. You know, if you look in Germany at the purchase of the sewage recycling activities there by the stores, you know, you could see the supermarkets taking a lead in this. There's a big opportunity there.
But you see,
they don't mind it commoditized. You know, they can say, Sainsbury's own label. That's fine for them.
Yeah, being too prescriptive on one solution has always a risk of being counterproductive. I think the major thing missing in some parts is accountability. And if it is anything, the FMCG companies have taken accountability. Not all of them, mainly European ones rather than American ones, unfortunately. And whether they'll succeed is not totally clear either. And if there's one big gap between the chemicals companies that Gabriel was talking about, is there doesn't seem to be a public commitment of what role they're going to play, right? There's a head in the sand. So, and I was hoping that being the big key. Why does Nestle have to commit to, let's say, 30 or 50% of all the material being recycled, post-consumer recycled material, and why don't these other companies do so? I mean, it's not going to be easy for Nestle, Danone, or Unilever, but they're putting their head out there that within 5 years, it's going to be a huge progress. Is that sticking their head out and taking accountability that I feel is too limited to FMCG companies only?
I think that's really interesting. I think one model, now this is just a hypothetical, I've discussed it a bit internally with our team, is that the past 25 years have seen a lot of conflicts between organizations and institutions on supply chains around climate. Friends of the Earth versus somebody else and what have you. And that's a necessary voice, it's a necessary process. But here, the issue is, as Paul and Bruno and Tatiana, you've all described, the protagonist is an efficient and an efficient supply chain, where efficient is described with higher profitability, longer term contracts, greater economic stability, and efficient is also described as decreasing negative ESG, environmental social governance impacts, which in the case of the EU, we have a very clear set of policies driving towards 2025. So then protagonist is an efficient supply chain, and the antagonist is an inefficient supply chain. And I think what's happened is structurally, a lot of the executives in the industry are looking at are still on the previous model, which is like, here's a list. I don't want to be number 80 on the list. I want to be number 10 on the list, which doesn't really solve the problem. If you're looking from a name and shame model, when on the opportunity side, it's around looking at strengthening supply chains and turning them into protagonists, making that the protagonist, as the EU is working to do. Well, I mean, we're close to the end of our panel discussion. That's my closing note. I would like to first give Paul about 30 seconds, and then Bruno, and then we'll close with you, Tatiana. And before we do that, I'm just thrilled to have the three of you here. Thank you so much for the rich conversation. We're really grateful for your support, and the feedback has been very positive. I've gotten texts on my phone, emails, everything else. And you'll get a list of all the questions and who've asked that. I'll facilitate all that. If people want to be introduced, just email me directly. And so with that, I'll pass the first closing note to you, Paul.
Well, thank you very much. That is fascinating discussion and great questions as well. As I say, I am incredibly optimistic at this point. I think we're going to see a very great progress over the next 3 to 5 years. You talk to John Kerry, you talk to Franz Timmermans, they're saying we can't leave this till 2030, too late. We have to move fast now. And so we are going to have winners and losers. And winners and losers from an investment point of view is also a very exciting opportunity. And we know what needs to be done. Exactly as Bruno was saying, we can't give you exact prescriptions because we haven't done it yet, but we know the direction of travel. Now, that's all we need to start.
Absolutely, process. Bruno, over to you, please.
Thank you, Gabriel. Very much on Paul's line, optimistic. Why? Because consumers didn't care 5 years ago, and today consumers genuinely care about waste issues a lot more. We all sort of woke up in the previous generation worrying about the climate, and we sort of suddenly figured out it isn't just about CO2, we have biodiversity, we have waste. So that's a really positive thing. My FMCG companies are more like a conduit to channel consumer demands. If anything, if only the politicians could be following as hard and as fast on it. And so I hope these consumers don't just talk to Unilever and Nestle and Danone, but equally to their politicians. Because between the two of them, yes, in the next 5 years, we can make huge progress, given how much has happened already in the last few years alone.
It's absolutely true. We cannot solve the climate crisis without solving the plastics crisis. And the opportunity set intersects between both. Tatiana, over to you, and thank you all. Once Tatiana closes, we'll sign off.
Intensive use and production of plastic exposes companies and investors to material business risks, and diligent directors and investors will be aware of those risks and act to counteract them, to seek for solutions to scale up sustainable business models. And I have faith in that many investors are going to act. but it's not just the will of the investors to act. The policy cliff is real and the litigation risks are real too. So if you don't jump, you'll get pushed. So it's better to be faster.
That's a great closing statement. If you don't jump, you'll be pushed. Wow. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all of you who tuned in. I'll share the notes shortly with everybody, and have a wonderful week. Thank you so much.